Yeah, so this is, I guess, is going to be further elaboration on understanding the sort of the cultural wave of fascism that we are in the grips of, and how it has permeated from institutions and, let's say, an institutionalized culture which essentially has a very formalistic view of defining its morality. So it effectively has a very, it's like having an ethical system that's purely based on appearances, and therefore it's important essentially to have the kind of the authority, to be an authority on something. Because the actual sort of principles themselves are not actively exposed and vulnerable to interrogation. So everything is in its own lane, as it were. But in the same way that effectively the medical professional advice on dietary guidelines, for instance, is basically a fraud. It's even within their own understanding of the advice that they give, there's like a less than 1% success rate. It's in terms of helping people get healthy, for instance, and effectively the sort of the kind of evidence that they have for the dietary guidelines which they currently have are epidemiology, which effectively is very much like identity politics' use of statistics. It's sort of, you cut up these generalizations in all these ways and it gives you supporting evidence, but it doesn't deductively support the actual measures taken. It tends to prove the point if you look at it from that very specious framework. So it lends a kind of collateral supporting evidence, which can only be which is effectively pandering to a kind of strange sort of groupthink. And then when anyone complains, they say, "Oh, look at all these epidemiological studies." It's a weird sort of recourse to sentiment. Okay, let me try and hash this out in a more intellectually delineated form. But and this is especially also the case in terms of how the legal theory has been perverted, as it is perverted in all fascistic cultures, and all it's generally the legal theory which then eventually kind of grinds down the rest of society into sort of being in the same image of its form of how it conducts itself, in terms of what is adjudicated to be a legitimate argument, a legitimate proof for a claim, and its disgusting reliance on this disgusting formalism, which, as long as you can say that it is working to achieve the end of equality, any means, even that be they socially unjust means, are rendered social justice, are translated into social justice. It's almost like a semantic game, in the same way that evidence, the notion of evidence, is abused in the scientific realm, where essentially you get into this science of statistics, effectively. And that is regarded as credible. So you get this kind of inductive, you get a sort of a bank of inductive indicators, and if you've got enough of those inductive indicators sort of nodding you on, or confirming, or lending credence to your design or your policy or your guideline, then it's good enough. You know, the sort of the standard of proof, the burden is taken as being met. And having that kind of pathetic and feeble and intellectually embarrassing state of affairs is effectively what allows for the moral laxity, which is effectively the core foundation to a fascistic culture and a fascistic state. And so, you know, basically on kind of tentative speculation that this policy might actually help transformation, even though it's an abject failure, even though, you know, but it never takes accountability for its own consequences. It's never questioned. In fact, if it doesn't fit, if it doesn't work, it just means that you're not doing it radically enough, you're not doing it violently enough, you're not being disruptive enough. You know, so it's this weird kind of self-righteousness in which the state and state authority can never be questioned, because it has this tentative, speculative, moralistic veneer that's slapped onto the face of it, which is validated by this very low bar of you know, wishful thinking, or actually more accurately, it's a kind of presumed self-righteousness that the ideological moralistic program is worthy of taking precedence over pragmatism and the actual effects that are being measured and the actual, you know, so, I mean, the Constitution of South Africa was actually, especially in the limitations clause, shows this incredible defense which the citizenry and the individual is afforded against the state, that it can effectively argue pragmatic grounds as to why the measures being employed effectively make it unreasonable for the state to conduct its policy in a way that is not prone to challenge on such common sense grounds, as it were. But now common sense has effectively been completely chucked out the window as this new interpretation of the law, which has been promulgated right from the top, right from the Chief Justice himself, that effectively can only disguise its own failure by effectively using racialized, essentially propaganda for war crimes, effectively, for more identity politics and more racialist consciousness and a racialist imagination to patch over and divert pressure from an irresponsible and unaccountable government, especially under this legal theory, which has effectively already redrawn the boundaries to such an extreme and radical degree that I mean, we effectively don't live, in principle, we no longer live in a liberal, democratic, non-racialist society. These things are simply things that are given lip service to. They are seen as an ends and not as a means to an ends in themselves, basically. They are used as a kind of weird semantic deception, you know. It's the same way in which the Nazis concealed all their vile aggression in, kind of defensive rhetoric. Everything is done in defense of these high and wholesome ideals of just it's a very sort of autistic and relativistic paradigm in which you are forced into looking at the world via your identity, via this new tribalism, via this new very toxic consciousness, which has to be employed just to excuse the tremendous amount of disruption and breakdown of interpersonal connectivity, of the poisoning of the labor market, of making it impossible for people to trust other people's credentials, of making the labor market unworkable effectively, because you have to pay a premium to hang on to tokens of black economic empowerment that award your company with a certain amount of points. And so small businesses effectively can't afford to retain the staff that they might give experience to, because they'll just get headhunted. And this added pressure and turmoil that's essentially crippling the development of what should be a developing economy is effectively arrested by an overregulated and just especially in industries like education, for instance, where unions are effectively holding back development because they're too powerful, and no one is interested in actually trying to redress a balance between the employer and unions, who are effectively maiming the economy. They're very good for people that have jobs, and they're very bad for people who will never get a job effectively because of the lack of growth. Whereas if we had a thriving small and medium business sector, if that was the strongest part of our economy, then in fact big business has to really work quite hard at providing appealing packages and salaries that compete with small businesses, which are often much more vibrant and capable of remunerating their staff, at least in an environment of growth. The floor that gets raised in a labor market really is always driven from the kind of the small and medium business sector. If you don't have that, you don't often have a healthy labor market. But we have so much regulation and overregulation on racialist kind of policy that it effectively it's like a non-starter. I need to get more into this intellectual issue about how the notion of knowledge itself has been corrupted by this wave of fascistic values and the fascistic worldview, which cultural appropriation is another good way of understanding, how it's essentially the gateway to the fascistic worldview and the reduction of people and moral consideration into foremost identity, units of identity as being the prime entity that enjoys moral consideration and moral protection is first the identity, and secondary, and then as a secondary subset of issues, individuals have to essentially kowtow that line and that narrative. They have to appease the narrative of correcting the narrative of identity. Everyone becomes pervasively and invasively expected and enslaved to fulfill that mandate and that program that the culture becomes effectively drunk on, intoxicated by.